Welcome, brave souls, to the chilling depths of horror and detail, the realm where the shadows whisper ancient secrets and nightmares come to life. I am your guide through the darkness, and on this channel, we delve into the spine-chilling world of Wendigo horror stories that will send shivers down your spine. First story: The Wolf at Skinwalker Ranch. My wife and I were sitting on the front porch after a long day of moving furniture and boxes into our new house. We were tired, red-faced, and sweating after sharing the burden between the two of us. The sun was setting on the horizon as we sipped our warm beers and looked out over the landscape of our newly acquired ranch. Fields stretched off into the distance as far as the eye could see, not a neighbor in sight for miles. The cows were grazing, looking unhappy, their tails hanging straight down as they ignored the fresh grass all around them. I figured they were just upset from the long move. "Why do you think they needed so many locks?" my wife asked, taking a sip of her beer. It was the elephant in the room, so to speak, and I had to admit I was curious about it as well. Every door in the house had a deadbolt on it, inside and out. Not only that, but the windows were shielded by thick iron bars. The old owners had left long before we could ask them about it. The folks who lived here before were probably paranoid about home invasions so far from the city. "We'll take them down, and I'll fill the screw holes with wood putty. We'll paint them over, and they'll be good as new. You wanted to redo the trim anyway. And the bars on the windows? That'll take a bit more work, but I can get it done before the weekend. I'll just have to run over to the hardware store to grab a few things. I can't find some of my tools. Maybe they got lost during the move." My wife was no longer paying attention. She was staring at some point far off in the distance. "What's that?" she asked, pointing. I followed her finger and looked to see a large gray wolf moving in the fields. It seemed to be stalking deliberately toward us, marching at a steady, quick pace. It came to a fence and did the strangest thing. Instead of leaping over it or burrowing under it, as I'd expected, it stood up on two legs like a person, grasped the loose corner of the wire fencing, and pulled it up, ducking between the strands and stepping through one leg after the other. It was exactly how I would have done it. Once it was on the other side, it went back on four legs and started its progress toward us again. Then it looked up and saw us staring at it. The gray wolf stayed still for a few seconds, then disappeared in the tall grass suddenly. It was just gone. It didn't dive into the grass or duck down. It was there, and then a moment later it was just gone, vanished in the blink of an eye. The two of us sat uneasily on the porch, and I stood up to look in the distance, trying to spot the creature. But it was nowhere to be found. "I'm going inside. You should come too," my wife said, sounding nervous. We went in and locked the doors at the front and back of the house. The bars stayed on the windows after that, and my wife didn't mention the deadbolts on the doors in the house again either. The two of us went to bed that night with little talk between us, a big difference from the ecstatic chatter that had been the norm all day prior to the event with the wolf. Or whatever that thing was. I got the feeling wolf was not quite the right word. That night, something else even more disturbing happened to us both. I woke up in the early hours of the morning, around 3:30 a.m. according to the bedside alarm clock. When I looked next to me in the bed and saw my wife's spot was empty, I became immediately concerned for her safety. Where could she have gone at this time of night? I wondered. That was when I heard her voice calling to me from outside the window, asking insistently for me to let her in. Her cries for help were muffled through the glass, and I lifted the heavy old window pane up to hear her better. "What are you doing out there?" I asked, worried about the wolf we'd seen earlier. I was looking around for glowing eyes reflecting the moonlight nearby. Standing on two legs or four, I wasn't sure which to expect. I must have been sleepwalking, she said dreamily. The front door locked behind me somehow. You have to let me back in. Please. It's cold out here. I'll be right down, I said, without thinking about how impossible all of that was. I was only concerned for her safety at that moment, and she had been known to sleepwalk occasionally, so that part seemed to make sense. I raced down the stairs in my boxers and grasped the front doorknob in my hand, turning it. Thankfully, it was locked, or who knows what might have happened. Reaching up to turn the lock, I was startled to hear a voice behind me. "What are you doing?" my wife asked. I jumped at the sound, my heartbeat quickening. But what terrified me even more was what I had just seen outside. Given the time frame it had taken me to get downstairs, it was impossible that it had been her. It was like someone else had been out there, wearing her skin and speaking in her voice. Looking at the woman standing in front of me, I had no doubt it was Christine, my wife. Panting, I walked over to her and hugged her tightly. "What's wrong?" she asked. I didn't answer, afraid she would think I was losing my mind. Some things we don't share with anyone, not even our significant others. We take them to our grave, afraid that if we speak of them out loud, it will make them true, and it will make the source of the impossible things return. So instead, I just took her hand and led her up the stairs, looking back nervously over my shoulder at the front door, waiting for the sound of a key turning in the lock, or the sound of it being broken down by powerful forces beyond my control. Instead, there was a gentle knock, polite almost at first, but then the fist began to pound against the front door of the house louder and louder, more and more insistently. My wife stopped, turning around to look at me on the stairs. "Who could that be at this time of night?" she asked. "Just ignore it. Let's go to bed. They'll go away eventually." After a few moments of hesitation, she turned around and began going up the stairs once more, taking a couple nervous looks back as she did. We kept walking up the stairs as the pounding continued, devolving into steady scratching noises that didn't cease until daybreak. "What were you doing down in the basement last night?" my wife asked at the breakfast table the next morning. Neither one of us mentioned the sounds at the door the night before. We were both trying to act like it had never happened. In the light of the morning, it seemed like a shared hallucination, a bad dream brought on by warm beer and too much time spent moving boxes without enough assistance. "In the basement?" "I wasn't in the basement," I told her. "Yeah, you were. You were calling my name, asking me to come down there." I looked at her with concern. "When was this?" "Right before I found you at the front door. I figured I just missed you, that you found whatever you were looking for down in the basement and went into the kitchen for a snack or something. But then I found you by the front door. I was never in the basement last night." She looked at me, puzzled. "Of course you were. Who else would have been calling for me from down there?" I debated telling her what I had seen outside and decided I probably should. We were clearly dealing with something very strange here, and we needed to be on the same team if we were going to figure it out. "Christine, did you go outside at all last night?" "No." "What does that have to do with Dash?" "Okay, so here's the thing. I saw you outside. At the same time, when you were going down to the basement, you were calling to me from out front, saying you had been sleepwalking and you were locked out. That's why I was at the door. I never went down to the basement, and I don't think that was really you outside either. I think there's something else causing all this to happen. What the hell could cause that to happen?" I opened my mouth to answer when there was a polite rapping at the door. The two of us sat dead silent for a few moments, unsure what to do. The knocking came again, and I heard a man's voice, muffled through the door, saying, "There's a car here. Maybe they're out in the fields. Should we just leave it on the doorstep?" a woman's voice asked. "I don't like being here any more than you do, but that seems a bit rude. Maybe we should come back." Christine and I both stood up, sensing that this was not the same entity from the night before. I don't know how I could tell, but I just could. This wasn't an evil presence. It was just some neighbors coming by to welcome us. And they sounded like they might know something more than we did about the ranch and its mysteries. I opened the front door and saw a man and woman with their backs turned, walking away from us. They spun around when they heard the sound of us opening up. "Oh, hi there. We're the Turnbulls. We live down the road. Technically next door, as if there is such a thing out here. But we do share an easement with you to access the river. Jack takes the cattle down that way, sometimes for a change of scenery." The man put his arm around his wife's shoulder and whispered something in her ear. She abruptly stopped talking, realizing that she was rambling on nervously. "Sharon, I'm sure they don't want to get into all that. We just wanted to stop by and welcome you to the neighborhood, so to speak. It's nice to have another couple living next door again. This place has been empty for so long." My wife and I looked at each other with surprise. As far as we knew, the place had been occupied right up until our arrival. It hadn't shown signs of disrepair or neglect, so we'd had no reason to think otherwise. Really? No wonder the place was such a bargain. How long was it empty for? The man and woman shared a look. "Oh, not that long. A few years. Anyways, we just wanted to bring this casserole. We have a few errands to run, but it was great meeting you both. Come on by our place anytime. We're number 56981. The next driveway on your side. Up that way," the man said, hooking his thumb eastward. I had never seen anyone introduce themselves and run so quickly. I try not to take it personally. "It was so nice to meet you both," the woman said, taking a few quick steps towards my wife and handing her the casserole dish. "You can keep that dish, by the way. It's Pyrex. Great for casseroles." She backed up to join her husband, looking around the property nervously as she did. "Hey, can I ask you something?" The two of them looked ready to run back to their car, but they stopped and nodded, shifting on their feet anxiously and waiting for me to speak. "Have you ever seen anything? How should I put this? There's been a couple weird occurrences since we moved in, and I was just wondering if you could tell us anything. Is this place haunted? Is that why it was so cheap? I could tell you guys are nervous. Just give us something to work with. Please. We're getting a little freaked out." The woman looked pleadingly at her husband. He nodded to her, and she went back to the car and got in the passenger seat, where she sat darting her eyes around from side to side. "What exactly did you see?" the man asked. "Wait, no. Don't tell me. It's better if we don't speak of them. They know when you talk about them. It's better if we don't." "Well then, how do we get rid of them?" "You don't. These things have been around a lot longer than you or me. My wife and I get our share of strange events on the ranch next door too, but not as bad as here. This place, well, there's something here that makes it special. And not in a good way. I'm sorry to say. I'd tell you more, but it would only make things worse. It always does." There was a sound of knuckles rapping against the glass, and I looked to see his wife banging on the car window, looking with wide eyes at us and pointing into the distance towards the fields. My eyes followed where she was pointing, and I looked to see the large gray wolf was back, and it was moving towards us again. "I told you, we're not meant to speak of them. I need to go. The two of you should decide soon if you want to stay. This place will change you, and it will take things from you. You only get so long to decide. If you wait to see what the changes will be, it will already be too late. Trust me." With that, he turned away and went back to his car. He started the engine and drove off much quicker than I would have thought safe on the dirt driveway, swerving and leaving a cloud of dust hanging in the air around us, obstructing my view for a few seconds. When I turned around again, the wolf was much, much closer. It was about 50 yards away and closing in fast. It was looking at me intently. My wife was running back towards the house, yelling at me to come, But I was frozen, watching the wolf as it stood on its hind legs again. Not a wolf. Stop calling it a wolf. It's not a wolf. It's just trying to fool you into thinking that's what it is. But it's so much more dangerous than that. I tried to take a step, but my legs wouldn't budge. My eyes were locked on the wolf as it began to stalk towards me. No longer an animal, but something else wearing an animal suit. The ancient leathery-skinned humanoid beneath the wolf armor could be glimpsed occasionally as it strode like a hunter in my direction, taking long steps, moving low to the ground. The fur pieces were simply strapped onto it like clothing, the wolf head strapped on like a hat. "What are you doing? Get in here!" My wife yelled one more time, and my foot suddenly started to move. As soon as it did, I found I was unfrozen and finally able to start running, and not a second too soon. The house was close, but the thing was fast. When it saw me beginning to run, it became a wolf again in an instant. The idea that it was anything, but that seemed ludicrous as I watched it race towards me on all fours, its snapping jaws dripping saliva as it dove to cut me off. This thing was a massive gray wolf through and through. It could be nothing but that. And yet my eyes had begged otherwise just a moment before. If not for my wife, it might have gotten me. But she saw what was happening and took a large rock we had been using as a doorstop and threw it straight at the thing's head. It missed, hitting the beast in the shoulder instead, but it was enough to drive it back for a brief second, which was all I needed. I ran into the house and slammed the door shut behind me. An instant later, the scratching began again. Soon there was another one at the back door, scratching it as well. The sounds continued for hours. When the noises stopped, and I finally ventured outside again, I found that 3 of the cattle had been killed. The others were scared out of their wits, hiding huddled together in a corner of the field near to the house. Their eyes darted around the fields, reminding me of how the neighbors had looked as they scanned our property for the things lurking in the shadows. I was beginning to suspect we were not going to be able to stay in this place much longer. Even if we could survive, this was no way to live. That night, my wife and I sat in the living room with all the blinds and curtains drawn, discussing what we would do. The house wouldn't sell quickly. That much was obvious based on the neighbors' statements. The 2 of us decided we would leave in the morning, regardless. We would stay in a motel until we found an apartment to rent, sacrificing all of our investment in the house. Even if we put it up for sale again, it would be a long time before we made any portion of our money back. But it was too dangerous and too terrifying to stay. "I'm going to bed," my wife said, looking tired. "Come upstairs soon, okay? I don't want to be alone." "I'll be up in a minute," I told her. "I just want to grab a glass of water." She nodded sleepily and went up the stairs slowly, looking depressed. We had dreamed about this move for so long, and now it was all coming to ruins. I felt sad about it too. I went into the kitchen and poured a glass of water. After drinking it down in one long gulp, I decided I needed another. It had been a long day, and I'd been too distracted to drink anything. A noise came from upstairs, a scraping sound like claws. Setting down the glass, I turned around and listened closely. "Christine?" She didn't reply. I took a few steps across the linoleum floor of the kitchen before calling out again. Once again, there was no answer. By the time I got to the bottom of the stairs, my heart was pounding so fast and hard I felt like it would beat right out of my chest. I opened my mouth to call her name one more time when I saw it. The wolf that wasn't a wolf strode on 2 legs across the gap at the top of the stairs, then disappeared around the corner, heading towards my wife. It was so quick that I thought for a moment I could have imagined it. Just a gray blur that was gone in an instant. If not for the fact that it looked down the stairs at me and smiled, its long canines gleaming in the light. Its eyes were pure blackness. I ran up the stairs as fast as I could, terrified of what it would do to her. When I got to the second floor, I looked down the hall to see all of the doors were closed. It was as if the whole thing had really been just my imagination. Taking an unsteady step towards the bedroom, my heartbeat did not slow down even slightly. My hand was shaking as I reached for the doorknob, turning it and entering the master bedroom. I entered hesitantly, finding the room dark and my wife asleep in bed. Part of me wanted to wake her up, but for some reason I didn't. "It will be fine, just go to bed," my irrational thoughts said. My pounding heart began to slow and my eyelids grew heavy. "This is fine," my mind told me. "Everything is fine. Just go to sleep now." Trying not to think of what I had seen just moments before, I climbed into bed, getting in next to my wife and shivering while my body warmed up beneath the sheets. There was a soft sound of padding footsteps outside the bedroom door. Scratch, scratch, scratch. Something wants to get inside the bedroom. And a strange, foreign voice in my mind is telling me to let it in. Second story. I think, my woods are haunted? Almost 3 years ago, I moved into a quaint little farmhouse that sits on about 15 acres of land. The house was built in the early 80s and is quite active for spirits, leading me to believe it is some form of portal between the mortal realm and the dead. Most of this property is wooded, and it is quite beautiful. However, in the woods a little bit off the trail used for hunting, there's a building that is a shed or cottage of sorts. This building looks old, older than the house, built maybe a decade prior. There is nothing particularly odd or unsettling about it at first glance, but if I walked between 5 to 10 feet of it, I got dizzy spells and started feeling very faint, even passing out a couple times. For that reason, I would never go in the wooded area alone, out of fear I might pass out and nobody find me. One night about 8 months ago, I was in the wooded area with a friend and I saw somebody circling the building. I looked at my friend and pointed to the person, asking them who it was. My friend looked at me puzzled and told me that there was nobody there. This chilled me to the core because I know I can see otherworldly beings such as ghosts and demonic entities, but they don't usually look just as solid as you and me. Normally, they have a slight glow and transparency to them, but this one didn't. I grabbed my friend and ran out of the woods, panicked. We didn't go in the woods the rest of the time they were at my home. A couple days later, however, I decided to venture into the woods to investigate the being. It was around midnight, so it was quite dark outside. I went to where the building was, and there she was. I'm not quite sure who she is, but she stands between the height of 5 feet 10 inches and 6. She had silky black hair that stopped around her hips. She was unnaturally pale and wore a dress or nightgown that went down to her ankles. She seemed to be calling out for a child. I got a little unsettled because the name she was calling out was the nickname I've had since my toddler years. At first, I thought it may have been a coincidence, but then I saw what she was holding. It was a plushie that I'd had since birth, and still have to this day. It's my comfort item, so that really unsettled me. I mustered up courage to say hello to her, and she just stared at me, blankly. I then made the very stupid mistake of stepping too close to the building, being about 7 or 8 feet away from it. It was as if she had gained a conscience, and she lunged for me. I had never been so scared in my life. I bolted out of the woods in a panic, gaining multiple scars on my arms and face from tearing through the area blindly. As I reached the clearing and got out of the wooded area, I turned around heavy breathing and bleeding from cuts and scrapes. She stood there at the tree line and then just vanished. It was as if she'd not been there at all. I moved out of the house about 2 months ago, but even the mere thought of seeing that thing again sends a wave of chills and dizzy spells throughout me. Third story. Something is replacing the animals on my farm. I'm my husband, Ralph, 73-year-old male, and I, 71-year-old female, own a relatively small property in the country that we use to raise sheep. It's not much, but we bought it together around 50 years ago and have worked it ever since. Even in our relatively old age, we still keep up the work, though with an admittedly smaller flock. All our children have left since none of them were particularly keen on taking over the business. But that suits Ralph, and I just fine since we would prefer a quieter life with our 3 sheepdogs. However, things started going wrong a few months ago. It started with a rat. We've always dealt with the stupid things running around the farm. They come from the woods for the feed, you see. But this winter it was especially bad. Our traps would be full daily, and we were getting sick of replacing them. It was a full infestation, that worst I'd ever seen. One night, Ralph and I lay in bed, tired after a long day of work, when I looked up to see a rat on the mantel. Nothing unusual, of course, but still not something you'd like in your bedroom. But this thing was different. It wasn't right. Seeing the look on Ralph's face, I knew he was thinking the same thing. It was hard to describe what was wrong with it. I guess the closest word would be misshapen. It was wrong, with lumps in places that shouldn't have lumps and bulbous eyes that glowed with malcontent. It was bent and broken as if its bones had been twisted and mangled, but there was no sign of injury. Ralph got out of bed fast, grabbing the gun he kept under his pillow. He aimed at the creature, and it scurried away as he fired. I would have usually scolded him for using the gun, as I've never been a fan of firearms. But in this case, I was too shocked to speak. I wasn't sure what I had just seen, but the image of its broken and bent body stuck in my brain and stopped me from sleeping the rest of the night. The next 2 nights passed without incident, but in the early hours of the 3rd day, Ralph came into my room carrying a large box. And it was the remains of one of the rats. It was another broken one like we saw the previous night. This time, however, it was different. The eye sockets still bulged with eyes too big for its body, but the skull looked more or less normal, except for a single bone sticking up out of the back of the head. When I asked Ralph about it, he said he hadn't noticed until now, but these were human eyes. At this I gagged and told him he was being ridiculous, and it must have just been a few weirdly shaped rats. He left the room without a word. I knew better than to ask what he'd do with the body. Days passed, and more of the rats appeared broken until the number of normal rats dwindled in comparison. Our dogs were no help, as they refused to even go near the things. By this point, we became used to seeing them, but those eyes still creeped me out. Ralph was right. They were so human-like that I wondered how it was even possible for a rat to look like that. Unfortunately, this was only the start. The next day, I was working in the fields rounding the sheep into a new paddock. Ralph fell ill and was unable to join me for today, but we've been arguing about the rats again, and I needed a break from him anyway. Everything went smoothly until my dogs came running back to me whining. I looked up at what they were running from. It was a sheep, standing still ahead of us. But it wasn't a sheep. It was wrong. Like the rats, it had eyes that looked human. It was again bent and broken, like a distorted image. Its fur was patchy, with bald patches all over its body. And instead of legs, it stood on bent stumps. There was a smell about the thing that made me gag. I called my dogs back and ran, but it followed me. It latched onto my leg with jagged, rocky teeth and wouldn't let go. I pulled my pistol and shot it, but the bullet seemed to bounce off its thick hide, and it didn't even notice. I restored to desperately clawing at the thing's face. I stuck my nail into its eyes, and it leaked a sticky black goo. It made an ungodly sound and pulled off my mangled leg. I called Ralph, and he came to pick me up. Nothing worked to kill the sheep, so we locked it in a pen down by the shearing sheds. The next morning I woke up with a terrible headache. Ralph came in to check on me, and I told him that it had to be some kind of monster replacing the animals. He told me I was being foolish and that it was probably just some kind of disease. I insisted it was something beyond our understanding, but he didn't believe me. He wanted to take me to the hospital to see about treating my leg, but it was a pretty bad injury, and the medical bills would surely put us in the red. My mother had been a nurse, so I had some kind of experience in patching wounds. Still, it left me bedridden for a few months. Ralph wouldn't let me work with or see the sheep during my rest. And to be honest, that was just fine with me after my experience. But whenever I asked about them, he'd go quiet and mumble some sort of platitude. It didn't sit right with me. So when I felt able enough, I went out to check on them as Ralph slept. What greeted me at the paddock were not sheep anymore. All of them were broken. Their eyes glowed, and their twisted and mangled shapes oozed black liquid from their various gashes. I screamed, and as I did, my dogs ran towards me. I felt a surge of relief until I saw what they had become. Tears leaked from my eyes as I saw their twisted shapes and bulbous, glowing pupils. How could this have happened? I raced back to the house in tears, ignoring the pain of wounds reopening on my legs. I took the gun from under the pillow and rushed to the paddock after waking Ralph. As I left the house, my dogs came up to me. They whimpered and barked as they approached. I raised the gun to shoot them, but I couldn't bring myself to. Just looking at them was too painful. I backed away and slammed the door shut behind me, locking myself inside. The gun was heavy in my hand. I had to do it. It was all his fault. If he hadn't have hidden this from me, none of this would have happened. I turned and walked towards the bedroom. Fourth story, the Skinwalker's house. I want to share this story because someone might find it useful, but I share this information urging you to be extremely careful, and I beg you to never use it unless you find that you must. During my freshman year of college, I lost control, mostly due to freedom from my parents and a group of friends who were more interested in a good party than a good grade. I spent more time sleeping and drinking than I did in class or studying. But all of that changed when I woke up in the hospital bruised and covered in cuts. I was told I had been in a car accident the night before. I and two others were driving home from a party when the car crossed into the center divider, rolling several times and tossing all of us from the car. Miraculously, I escaped the crash with some scrapes and bruises, but mostly unharmed. The other guy in the car, Michael, broke his arm and got a bad concussion. However, the third occupant, a girl named Sam, was tossed in front of the rolling car and crushed underneath it. It took a rescue crew 4 hours to extricate her from underneath the crumpled mess of metal, and by the time they got to her, she was beyond saving. The police had no idea who was driving during the crash, and I couldn't remember anything about that night due to my state of impairment. Michael and I got stiff warnings about driving while intoxicated or getting into a car with a drunk person, but other than that, we got off scot-free. My friends all said that Sam had been driving and that I was so fucked up I couldn't even walk, let alone drive a car. Despite their reassurances, I was haunted by guilt and uncertainty. Had I been driving when we wrecked? Why did I survive? Was I responsible for her death? Every night, I had nightmares of Sam calling for me from underneath her twisted metallic grave. I stopped leaving my dorm, stopped answering my phone, consumed by guilt and uncertainty. After a month of moping around my dorm, a friend of mine named Mark reached out. We talked for hours about my uncertainty and how I would never get answers. In response, he told me about the legend of the Skinwalker's house, a ramshackle green shack right off of Highway 380. Here a person could meet with the ancient beings and make deals and bargain, including asking questions that otherwise could not be answered. At first, I was incredulous. I thought Mark was fucking with me, trying to play a sick prank. But I was desperate to know, so I talked to some friends who had grown up on a nearby reservation. One of them put me in touch with a tribal elder named Richard, and after a few emails and lying about doing a research project, Richard told me about summoning a skinwalker, which the Navajo call Yinaldushii. When we first spoke, Richard was hesitant to talk about the subject. But after repeated calls and a face-to-face meeting, Richard explained the ritual to summon a skinwalker. As we finished our conversation, Richard warned me that when one makes a bargain with a witch, the witch always takes something in return. I will give you the same warning that Richard gave me. Yinal Dushii is not to be summoned or questioned on a whim. Please do not summon a Skinwalker unless you are ready to accept the consequences of your actions. If you decide to disregard my warning, you will need the pelt of a coyote for animal fat candles, a rosary that has been blessed by a priest, a liter of animal blood, and a crow's feather. Skinwalkers are most active right after sundown when there is a storm coming in from the southeast. The house where you can meet them is between mile marker 13 and 14. It's not hard to find. It took 3 months to find everything and for the perfect weather system to arrive. Mark and I drove together to the house around 5, just as the sun began to sink underneath the Magdalenas. Shadows oozed from the dilapidated house, its putrid green paint peeling off of the bleached bones of wood. The house had no windows or doors remaining, and I could smell the mildew and rot from the road. Mark and I climbed through the barbed wire fence in front of the house and made our way in as storm clouds rolled in, bringing with them peals of angry thunder. As we stepped inside, the smell of old rotting wood overwhelmed me, and I fought the urge to vomit as we sat down on the stripped wooden floor. We spread out the coyote pelt with the head facing me, placing the greasy wax candles at the ends of its paws. We then placed the crow's feather in the mouth of the coyote pelt. After setting up the pelt and lighting the candles, Mark left the house and parked the car to turn off a mile up the road. When I was sure he was gone, I took the rosary in my hands and pulled hard, scattering the beads across the floor and pelt. I sat down at the head and took the goat's blood I had procured from a butcher and dumped it across the pelt, spattering myself and the ground in dark maroon splatters. The storm continued its steady progression across the desert, and the roar of thunder rumbled in my chest. I closed my eyes and focused on the sound of the storm willing the creature towards me. I was lost deep in my focus when I heard it, a wolf's howl mixed with the screams of a woman, a horrible cacophony of animal and man swirling together. I opened my eyes to see the house wreathed in fog, the supernatural mist surrounding the house, but not permeating the structure itself. I heard a deep guttural chant coming from behind me as the creature approached the dilapidated wooden structure. Then came the footsteps, heavy padding steps crunched against the gravel behind me, quickly followed by the creak of wood as it stepped into the house. Its hot breath stung at the back of my neck as it sniffed me before circling in front of me. It had taken the form of a huge gray wolf, far bigger than even myself. The legs were too long and spindly, the hide patchy and balding, and its ears were short and tattered. The Skinwalker sat across the pelt from me and stared at me, staring at me like I was a rabbit about to be devoured. Its eyes were unlike those of a wolf's, with dark brown iris, angry white sclera, and round pupils. Suddenly the wolf let out a pained yelp and began to shudder. The braying whimpers of the animal filled the house as the fur and skin began to slough off the creature. The flesh sizzled and popped like frying meat as the body began to disintegrate, quickly followed by the opening of the chest cavity as a woman crawled out of the quickly decomposing wolf carcass. She had Native American features with skin so wrinkled and scarred I couldn't even guess her age. Hair hung in black, stringy strands, and worst of all, her lips were stretched and mangled so that her mouth could never close fully. She wore a patchwork of skins and pelts and a pair of antlers atop her head. Even sitting, she was nearly a head taller than me. She locked eyes with me, inhuman horizontal slits like a goat's peering out from behind the mess of hair that hung around her face. Her voice croaked in her throat, and a harsh, guttural dialect spewed forth from her lips. My heart sank. How could I have been so stupid? Why would an ancient Navajo, which speak English? She must have noticed my disappointment, because she reached for a pouch on her belt and took out some sort of gray waxy substance. She spread it on the tips of her index fingers, leaned forward, and jammed her fingers into my ears, her long, dirty fingernails scratching my ear canal. I yelled in pain and surprise at the intrusion, and she shifted her weight back into a sitting position. For a split second, my hearing faded before the sound of the storm surged back to life with a loud crack. The old woman locked eyes with me again, her face lit by the flickering candlelight. She spoke again, this time in English. "I have given you the gift of hearing. What is it you seek from my who goes on all fours?" Her voice low and raspy, like sandpaper on stone. My voice caught in my throat, my gut tightening at her words as I began to drift into a daze. I pushed my fingernails into the flesh of my palm until I could focus again. When I did answer, my voice was weak and uncertain. "I need to know if I killed her." She cackled, her voice spiraling to a crescendo until she sounded like a coyote baying at a frightened rabbit. "Very well, Billigana, I can help you. But what have you brought for me?" My stomach twisted painfully again as fear clawed at the back of my mind. "I haven't brought anything to give you." "Very well, if you have nothing to give, then I must take. Do you agree to these terms?" I paused for a moment considering what Richard had told me, but my guilt overwhelmed my rationale, and I shakily nodded my head in agreement at her terms. The Skinwalker smiled at this, revealing rows of miscellaneous teeth in her cavernous, distorted mouth. The teeth were inhuman, with sharp wolf-like canines mixed in with broad, flat teeth like a horse, in a horrible conglomeration of stained rows of ivory shards. The laughter came again from her lips, horrible coyote cackling that made my skin crawl. After another round of laughter, she produced a crude stone knife from her belt and with a quick motion ran it across the palm of her hand, spilling dark rivulets of blood onto the pelt before reaching towards me. I extended my hand, and she dug the cruel stone into the soft flesh of my palm. My skin cried out in agony, and blood wept from the exposed flesh underneath. She clasped my bleeding hand within human strength and pressed my wound against her own. Our blood mixed, and I felt it trickle down my arm and pool at the crook of my elbow. The woman began to chant and stared into my eyes as blood continued to flow freely down our arms onto the pelt beneath us. Her voice grew rough and animalistic as she continued her chanting. As suddenly as she had started, she stopped and let go of my now throbbing hand. "Oh, Billigana, how foolish you have been, just like your forefathers, with their drink and their endless cruelty. But her blood is on her own hands. Her foolish pride gave way to steel and glass. I have given you your answer, and now I will take two things from you. I take from you Nam Idzeal, your dreams." A wave of relief washed over me. I could live without dreams anymore. My dreams had been plagued with visions of Sam calling out for help from beneath her metallic tomb, begging for my help. With inhuman strength and speed, the Skinwalker grabbed my hand again and brought it to its mouth. I pulled hard against its grip and yelled to no avail as it pushed my thumb into its mouth. Hard teeth clamped down hard against the appendage, tearing away the flesh and bone of my thumb. Blood sprayed from the wound, painting a sanguine picture on its face. The creature chewed, and I could hear the crack of bone and the squelch of soft flesh in its teeth. I screamed in agony, clutching my hand and pressing the wound to my chest. My vision faded and blurred as I slumped to the floor. I wish I had gone unconscious. I wish I had closed my eyes. Instead, I watched as the Skinwalker tore at the flesh of its face, its long claw-like fingernails shredding through skin and muscle. The Skinwalker grabbed the skin on its arm and pulled, tearing it away from the muscle underneath, the flesh coming away like wet newspaper. I watched the muscles of its arm bulge and flex as it tore away the soft skin of its stomach, disemboweling itself. A gray coil of intestines lolled out of the abomination's abdomen, dragging against the rough wooden floor. It continued tearing away its flesh until only scraps remained on a skeletal frame. I willed my eyes to close, but they would not. I stared transfixed on the horrifying visage in front of me. The figure dropped to all fours and pulled one of the pelts it was wearing over its face. The pelt stretched and contorted, spreading over the skeletal limbs. The figure trembled and shook, twitching unnaturally. Then it began to grow, the limbs stretching and contorting, the chest becoming narrower. I watched as two sets of large antlers splintered out of the top of its head, stopping just before the ceiling. The figure continued to shift and contort until finally a massive bull elk stood in front of me. It strode out of the house, then paused and looked down at me. We locked eyes for just a moment before it let out a loud bugle and took off into the night. I pulled off my shirt and wrapped it tightly around my still bleeding hand. I staggered out of the house and glanced around, afraid the creature was waiting for me outside. There was nothing except for the rumble of thunder and the throbbing in my hand. I walked the mile to where Mark had parked the car, all the time pleading with my body to not bleed out. Mark paled when he saw me and rushed me to the hospital. I told the staff at the hospital that I had been messing with old farm equipment, a story they bought easily enough. In spite of everything that happened, I felt relieved with the knowledge that I hadn't killed Sam. The Skinwalker kept its word. It did take my dreams, because now I dream not about Sam, but instead about the Skinwalker. I dream of the Skinwalker changing and shifting. I watch time and time again as it tears apart animals for its dinner. The worst is when it attacks people, as I am forced to watch as it stalks hikers and campers. I watch as it disembowels them, mounts their bodies on a tree limbs, or skins them alive. I don't go into the woods anymore, for fear that I may see that thing again. But now and then, as I drift off to sleep, I hear the sound of an elk bugle followed by peals of coyote cackling. Fifth story, my Navajo grandma's wisdom. There are a few things you should know before I tell my stories. First off, I come from a maternal Navajo line. In case you didn't know, Navajo women pass their teaching and sacred medicines onto their daughters and granddaughters. Second, there is only one maternal granddaughter in each generation of our family. Thirdly, I was my grandmother's favorite grandchild. She taught me everything she knew, lessons that to this day serve me well. When a grandmother speaks in a Navajo family, everyone, and I mean everyone, stops and listens to her. That being said, my grandmother produced one daughter and 4 sons. Her sons were something else, ornery and tricksters beyond what you can imagine. My grandmother married an Irish farmer and raised their family on a farm 30 miles outside of a small town on the Utah-Colorado border. They had 15,000 acres of pinto beans and wheat. Their farm bordered the Navajo Nation, of which they visited often. Now, I was my grandmother's favorite grandchild. I was the only daughter of her only daughter. For whatever reason, my mother and grandmother were not close. So my grandmother took to teaching me her old ways, someone to carry on our traditions and medicines. We would spend summers gathering cedar berries and making them into protective necklaces. We would gather plants and herbs for teas, make sage bundles, and teaching me how to survive alone on my own out in the forest. She poured all her wisdom into me. One summer we had a family reunion. We all decided to stay at my grandmother's old farmhouse. All my cousins had come, and we all decided to stay in the upstairs bedroom. That's a whole story of itself. but we were excited to be together, and bravery in numbers, right? Now, the upstairs bedroom in the old farmhouse had a huge window that overlooked the farm. It was 4 foot high by 8 foot long. There was a door that opened up to the outside, but no porch or no stairs. If you went out that door, you would fall a complete story to the ground. Now, before it was bedtime, my uncle built a huge bonfire and all of us cousins roasted marshmallows. My grandmother was initially okay with me going out to do this, but she warned me to stay within the light of the fire and not to wander off. Now, it was completely pitch black out there. There are no neighbors, no outside lights, and you wouldn't be able to see your hand in front of your face if you had no light source like a flashlight or fire. We were all happy roasting our marshmallows and visiting. Then we started to hear coyotes yipping in the distance. My mom and her brothers, hearing this, started to howl back. See, my mother can mimic any animal noise on the planet. She was calling the coyotes up because we could hear them getting closer and closer. This is when my grandmother came out and got me. She shushed my mother and her brothers, telling them you don't call out to things in the night. They kind of just laughed it off, but continued after my grandmother took me inside. She got me ready for bed. I always slept with my grandmother. I knew I was always safe with her. But this being a special occasion, I wanted to sleep upstairs with my cousins. My grandma tried to discourage me from this, but I wouldn't be swayed. I was too excited. So my grandmother put my cedar berry necklace on me, and we went upstairs and smudged the room I would be sleeping in. She told me if I heard or saw anything to run to her room as fast as I could. She also told me not to be making noises and to be quiet and go straight to sleep. Now, my cousins and I were all set in beds for the night, and we were giggling and talking. I reminded them of what Grandma had told me. We shouldn't be so loud, for something might hear us. My cousin Jay laughed it off and said it was just old Indian superstition. He called out and started whistling. This gave me goosebumps. We were never to whistle at night, no matter what. Never. We sat and waited a couple of minutes, and nothing happened. I breathed a sigh of relief. A couple of hours later, we were all about ready to drift off when my hairs on the back of my neck stood on end. I looked around very, very carefully so that I wouldn't draw attention. I didn't see anything, but I could sense it. At first it started quietly. I could hear scratching on the outside of our house. I kept telling myself it was probably just a mountain lion and everything was okay. We were on the second floor, so we were safe. But I still had goosebumps and my scalp was crawling. I started to hear what sounded like claws softly crawling up the side of the house. I slowly rolled over to face the window. If something was going to come in, I wanted to see it first, so I could be the first one out of there. I should have gotten up right then and gone to Grandma. But I wasn't a particularly scared child. I thought I could handle whatever it was. It was a few minutes later the door handle on the outside door started to jiggle. At first I was sacred, then I thought, nah, it's only Uncle Z. You see, our Uncle Z was always playing scary tricks on us kids. And I thought for sure it was him. So I kind of chuckled thinking he's going to scare my cousins good. So I slowly turned my head, and every single one of my cousins' eyes were open wide as saucers. This gave me a good giggle. I turned back around toward the window, and the door handle was still jiggling. It was then that my cousin C asked me to go look and see what it was. I said okay. I didn't want anyone to think I was a scary cat. So I got up and tiptoed over to the door. I grabbed the door handle firm, so whomever was messing with it couldn't turn it anymore. I turned around and smiled at my cousins, and every single one of them had a sheer look of horror on their face. At the time I thought, geez, what a bunch of wimps. Then my cousin Jay stated to say something, but the thing with Jay was that he had a bad stutter when he got too excited or scared. He was saying, nah, 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 and he pointed at the window. I slowly turned around, my hair still standing on end on my neck and arms. And what I saw, y'all, let me tell you, I thought my Uncle Z had outdone himself on the scary mask this time. There was a cow's skull with just the eyes barely peeking over the window. Now, our window was open because it was hot, and I was standing right by it. Now, a couple of things hit me all at once. The smell. There was this horrible smell of death. It was so bad I could hear my cousin be gagged behind me. There was a cow skull that had two huge horns on it, like a Texas Longhorn, but we didn't have that type of cattle. No one did there. There were pale, animalistic eyes that were staring straight at me. Slowly, very slowly, these long, bony, bloodily fingers made their way over the window sill. But what I couldn't stop looking at was the cow skull. It was wet, not with water, but with blood and sinew. A smile broke over its face, as if it knew I was starting to realize this was not my Uncle Z. It opened its maw in a huge smile, showing dozens of razor-sharp teeth that pointed inward, like a snake's that have teeth like that, so when they eat something whole, it cannot escape back out. The smile cracked its skin when it smiled, and this puss-like stuff oozed out. Several things happened at once. It reached its hand in toward me. The hand started to instantly smoke, like it was burning. It yanked its hand back out, and it gave me a look of our hatred. I instantly thought how wise my grandmother had been to smudge. Then its long, bony finger with huge, bloodily claws started moving its finger to call me over to it. It was now smiling again, puss and all. I naturally reached up and held my cedarberry necklace. It saw this and turned instantly enraged. It let out this vile scream, "Aha, where?" Immediately I screamed, "Uncle Ziska, gun Navajo wolf." Almost instantly he was barging through our room with his .44 Magnum in his tidy whites. He saw it and he blew a hole through the window. The Navajo wolf jumped and started to run off into the timber, screaming impossibly loud the entire way. It was enraged it was denied what it had come for. My uncles searched all night for it, planning to kill it, but they never found it. Grandma had me in her arms almost right away. Never again did I leave my grandmother at night. That scream will stay with me until the day I die. Although that was not the last time I heard it. The next morning when we went outside, there were huge claw marks down the side of the house. I can't even begin to imagine what those claws could do to a human body. Thank goodness for my grandmother's wisdom and preparation. To this day, I still have my cedarberry necklace. A word of advice from Grandma. Never, and I mean never, call out into the night, because you never know what will answer you back. Thanks a lot for watching the video till the end. Subscribe to our channel Horror in Detail. Drop your opinions/suggestions in the comment section, and like the video as it helps with the YouTube algorithm.